Good day, everyone, and welcome to the 20th session of the Mental Health Commission of Canada's webinar series on integrating psychological health and safety in the workplace. Our topic for today's webinar is accommodations that support success at work. My name is Carla Thorpe, and I'm the Director of Prevention and Promotion Initiatives with the Mental Health Commission of Canada, and it's my pleasure to be here today hosting our webinar. So before we get started, I just wanted to go over a few housekeeping items. First of all, we will be having some time for questions and discussion at the end of the session. So we would ask that throughout the course of the presentation, if you do have any questions that come up, you can type those into the chat feature that you see on the lower right-hand corner of your screen. Or for some of you, it may actually be along a bar at the top that has a little bubble with the word chat underneath it. So when you go and use the chat feature, we would ask that you use the drop-down menu and send your questions to both host and presenter so that we can all see your questions at the same time. Also wanted to let you all know that the webinar is being recorded today so that we can archive it and post it on the Mental Health Commission's website following the presentation in about 2 weeks' time. We do have a large number of participants that are joining us today, almost 300 of you so far on the line. So we have muted all of your telephone lines when you joined the webinar today just to eliminate some of the background noise. So it's my pleasure to introduce to you three speakers that will be joining us today: Mary Ann Baynton, Dr. Ian Arnold, and Laura Lozanski. I'm sure they are names that are familiar to many of you that have been in the field of workplace mental health. I'll start by introducing Mary Ann Baynton. She wears many hats, one of which is as the Program Director for the Great West Life Center for Mental Health in the Workplace, which is part of Great West Life's public commitment to help employers address psychological health and safety in their workplaces. We also work very closely with Mary Ann in several other capacities, including in her role as Chair of the Technical Committee for the National Standard of Canada for Psychological Health and Safety in the Workplace. And Mary Ann also serves on the expert panel for a 3-year case study research project that the Mental Health Commission of Canada is leading. She also, in her spare time, does some consulting work through Mary Ann Baynton and Associates, and her latest venture has been to launch Mindful Employer Canada, which is a not-for-profit organization that celebrates the commitment of both employers and managers that are working actively to support positive workplace mental health. Joining Mary Ann today is Dr. Ian Arnold, who's a Senior Occupational and Environmental Health and Safety Specialist, who is certainly very well respected by his peers and associates, and also recognized for his many years of experience and his deep skills in workplace psychological health and safety. Ian serves with Mary Ann on the Technical Committee for the National Standard and also is working with the Commission on the expert panel for the Case Study Research Project as well. And last but certainly not least, joining Mary Ann and Ian today is Laura Lozanski, who's an Occupational Health and Safety Officer for the Canadian Association of University Teachers that provides service to over 65,000 academic members. She's also been a certified instructor with the Workers' Health and Safety Centre in Ontario since 1997. And certainly would like to thank all of our speakers for their time and for joining us on the webinar today. So we'll be getting started with our agenda for today's session, which is looking at how we can support employee success. Our brief agenda for the day is really to look at a tool to plan accommodations that support success at work, the process and also the journey that we've taken to date. As I mentioned, we will be leaving some time at the end of the session to address some of the questions that some of you sent through ahead of time, and also any questions that come up as you hear the discussion today. So with that brief introduction, I think we'll get started, and Ian, I'll turn it over to you to help get us started.
And I'll very quickly welcome everybody to the session, and note how pleased we are that so many people are on the line, and we're looking forward to your questions and hope that we can answer some of them as we go through the presentation itself. So Mary Ann, over to you.
Great. So today we're talking about a resource that is available at no cost on the website that you see there. What this is dealing with is the fact that managers often don't feel comfortable talking to employees about mental health related issues, and physicians often tell us that they're not comfortable creating an accommodation when they're not familiar with the workplace settings or demands. And what happens in these situations is the employee is the one who falls through the cracks. We wanted to look at providing a tool that helped to manage that differently. So I'm going to give you a brief overview before we talk a little bit more about how this tool came to be. But before I do that, I would like you to think about, as we're going through this, the fact that we are now at close to our 1-year mark for this resource, and we are going to be doing improvements to it, updates to it. And I really want to encourage you to think about ways that you could suggest improvement and be able to give that to us before June 5th, and then you can actually have an impact on what this will look like going forward. So to begin with, I want to take you through the different parts of the tool. The first one is really talking about what the job expectations are. And these are job expectations that have an impact on the psychological health and safety of employees. But they're also job expectations that have an impact on performance. In the second part, we talk about what the supports are that are provided by the employer for employees who might be experiencing mental health issues. Then we have a place for additional comments. Part 4 is actually a conversation that's held. And I'll take you now through to the first piece, which we've given you one example here, and hopefully most of you have gotten the resource yourself that you can look at the whole thing. But I just wanted to show you, in case you don't have it, that each of the job expectations has a place for the employer just to check off what they think the level of expectation is. This is important because often the employer is not completely aware, and this would require them to think about what the psychological demands of the job are. The next piece that you see there, the green column, is where the employee is able to check off what they feel their abilities are to do that part of the job. When we're talking about work relationships, what they think their abilities or their challenges might be. In this next section, this is where there's a variety of accommodation strategies are offered. There's strategies that have worked before for employees who have had a mental health related issue, but rather than narrow it down, we give a menu of options. And this is the area where the employee would speak with a healthcare professional or some other trusted person to explore options, and this is important, that support them to do the job, support them to actually be able to function in the workplace, rather than what unfortunately happens in some cases where the expectation is if you're accommodating somebody, it's accommodating them to not do their job. And what we know is that when somebody comes back to work and they're not able to do their job, it can build resentment among coworkers, and you can see, well, hopefully you can see that there is an area there where we can talk about how do you interact with coworkers. But it also creates resentment for the supervisor who still has to meet needs. And so there's a place there where we can talk about how do you have that discussion with the employee about performance in a way that's seen as supportive and not just punitive. And each of the expectations has this variety of suggestions to support a really productive conversation with the healthcare professional. And in this next piece here, what you're seeing is that we can start to explore what resources are available in the workplace. And this has a different value as well. One is the supervisor or manager may not be aware that all these things exist, so they're going to have to look into what the organization offers in order to fill this out. It's also that the employees sometimes are not aware of what the organization has to offer. But it also gives the healthcare professional an idea of what supports are there, what supports maybe they need to put in place for the employee, and it also can highlight for the employer what sorts of things maybe they want to put in place that aren't there now. And then this next piece is really important. It's an open conversation. There's a series of questions that are very specifically worded to help guide the conversation towards solutions. And one of the things that you should notice throughout this entire resource is it doesn't talk about illness. It doesn't talk about symptoms. It talks about the workplace issues in a way that is not stigmatizing and in a way that really focuses on helping someone to be successful in doing the job that they're hired for. Now I'm going to pass this over to Ian again, and he's going to share with you how this tool came to be created in the first place.
Thanks, Mary Ann, and it's good to have an overview and a taste of the tool before we get into some of the background on it. And all of you can download the tool free of charge, and it's displayed on the chat room, the URL to do that. In June 2013, we convened an Occupational Health Professionals Forum in London, Ontario, through the auspices of the Great West Life Centre for Mental Health in the Workplace to discuss what the needs were for occupational health professionals with respect to accommodation of employees with mental illness. At the conclusion of the forum, it was clear from the discussions, which actually were a full day of discussions ranging over a whole variety of topics, but what it really boiled down to was that there was a need for a process which engaged the three parties to this accommodation, the healthcare professionals, the employees, and the workplaces themselves, in discussion about what the needs are for accommodation, something that would help everybody understand better how folks could be accommodated in the workplace when they're dealing with mental health problems. To do this, to put this tool together, we brought together a number of occupational health professionals. I was involved in it. Dr. Suzanne Arnold, who's an educator and occupational health nurse, was involved. Dr. David Brown, who's a corporate medical director, was involved. And Dr. David Posen, who's a family physician dealing with mental health challenges in the workplace and is very familiar with this area, was also involved. So we worked together to develop the process now known as supporting employee success. We did this through a number of ways. We did the traditional approach of looking at literature that reflected return to work accommodation and successful return to work accommodation. We drew on the experience of all four people involved in developing the tool, and we went to workplace strategies for mental health on the Great West Life Centre and drew out a number of ideas from that source as well. So using these together, we came up with the tool that we felt was probably going to be the best chance of moving forward. And as Mary Ann mentioned, this is only a year ago that we actually launched the tool now, and we're looking forward to feedback before June 5th so that next fall we can make the changes that are necessary as we go forward. The tool is really designed not to be necessarily standalone. It can be used as a standalone process, or it can be used within an existing process in your workplace. Many workplaces already have methods to help bring people back to work or to help them stay at work with an existing problem in their own health area. And this process can work not only on its own, but within the existing processes. And as Mary Ann showed earlier, what we've done is try to develop a process that follows a sequence of events to put together the information that we need to help people return to work successfully. To do this, we complete the forums, pass them back and forth, and build in lots of opportunities for discussion and resolution of some of the gaps that may exist as well. Now, one of the other areas is that we're helped to explore job and task expectations of the individual employee themselves. And this has always been an issue for occupational health practitioners particularly, is that they don't understand what the needs are of the individual employee, and they don't understand what the needs are of the workplace. So by using this tool, we can look at the various workplace factors that have an impact on psychological health and well-being, at the requirements of an individual themselves, and at the requirements of the workplace, and come back with recommendations to try and bridge the gaps that may exist between these various requirements. One of the questions I often get is, well, how does this differ from the regular doctor's note? And I'm sure most of you are familiar with doctor's notes, and most of you are probably very frustrated with them as well. As both a physician and an occupational health professional, on the receiving end of doctor's notes, I know that they can be very frustrating because they don't tell you very much in many cases. Well, physicians and other occupational health practitioners can't give you diagnoses. That's a privacy breach. But what they can do is focus on the individual's capabilities and competencies, and the tool itself helps to draw these out so that when the occupational health practitioner or in the workplace tries to work towards accommodations, they have a better idea of what's really needed. So it's quite different from the doctor's notes. It provides the occupational health practitioner with good information on what the requirements are. It provides a discussion point for the employee and for the workplace themselves, and then it puts the employer in the position to really make a solid decision on whether there's opportunities for a good accommodation. And this is the real key to this whole process, is that now all the parties understand where they are and what can be done to help the individual return to work. There are three basic tenets for success, and I'm going to ask Laura if she can take over now and go through the next few slides on these. Laura?
Thank you, Ian. The three tenets that we have there are really important. They provide some clarity and a little bit of ease of understanding on the role of the parties. So the employer would be committed to accommodating the employee through an ongoing collaborative process. And where there is a union in the workplace, you would also want to incorporate a union advocate. And we'll talk a bit more about that later. The employee wants to stay at work and return to work and will strive to do the job with accommodations. Workers do want to return to work. It's very difficult for them when they're off work alone. They feel alone and isolated, and they want to come back to work and feel like they're part of something, that they belong and they're being productive. So that's really important. Job expectations and the requirements of the job are clearly understood, and I think that's what we're trying to articulate throughout this process, is understanding the work. Workers understand their work better than anyone else, and so it's connecting the dots between the supervisor and the worker on exactly what it is that they're doing and what they will need so that they can get that job done. From a union perspective, where there is a union in the workplace, it's really important that the union be invited into the process as early as possible, because we can act as advocates, and that's whether you're developing the process of what you would do generically or whether it's for a particular worker. Members see their union reps as reputable and reliable resources for assistance, and do the reps actually promote or support the program that's happening in the workplace? So they look to them for some guidance. They can also help prevent problems from arising by liaising with the employer and supporting the worker. Thinking outside the box is really a good thing that we do in the labor movement. We look at how the program is going, but what other things might we be able to do to support the program and support the worker, because we believe that what helps one worker in the workplace helps everyone. So we can identify the process in advance, which is really important because we actually need to identify what this process is in advance, because this improves the comfort level of the union rep, because now they have some knowledge and understanding of what the program is, and that can in turn help with assisting the worker achieve some success. What's really critical is that this normalizes mental health issues in the workplace. Mental health issues are part of a continuum of life and a part of a continuum of work, and it can be something very simple or it can be something very complex, but we want to ensure that people understand that.
So thank you, Laura, because what you're doing is really showing how this particular resource, this particular process should necessarily include the employee, the manager, a trusted healthcare professional, but also the union. And if we're all working to support that employee to be successful, if we're all on the same page, that makes it much easier for everyone. When we put the employee in the middle of a controversial or an adversarial process where the doctor and the manager are arguing, or union and management are arguing, it has the impact of making it difficult for the employee. Someone's just asked a question here, what if the employee doesn't want the union involved? And that's always their perspective. Do you want to speak to that?
Sure. Sometimes the employee wants a lot of confidentiality and a lot of privacy, and they don't feel comfortable about having the union involved, and that's certainly their right. One of the important things for unions to do is ensure that they are connecting with their members around this issue. They're part of the process with the employer so that they're able to support the program that's happening in the workplace, and that they just make themselves available should that worker want to reach out at some point in time and speak to them.
Yeah, and I think, as you say, it depends on the workplace. There's a lot of people that depend heavily on the union for support, and others where it's just not the way it is for that person. So I want us to take a pause here to answer some of the questions that have come in and to invite people. I just don't want to run out of time before we answer your questions. So we're going to take a few now, and then we'll also have some time at the end for other questions that come up. So Carla, you've been monitoring the questions that have been coming in?
Yep, so we do have a couple that have come in already, but I'll invite some others. If you do have some questions regarding some of the information that's been presented so far, if you could please enter those into the chat feature and just use the host and presenter or the all panelists to send those in, that would be great. The one that has come in speaks to how employers move forward when they might know that someone obviously is off work, but they don't necessarily know the circumstances around that and whether it's due to a mental health issue or a physical health issue. So what suggestions would you have on using the tool in that kind of a situation?
So you know, this is one of the things that we've talked about before, the importance of keeping in touch with people when they're off work for any reason. But what happens in a workplace is there is no discussion or communication about this approach. And so people might feel uncomfortable calling. The person that is being called might see it or feel that it's harassment. But in fact, being upfront with employees and saying, you know, it's our process that we're going to contact you or get in touch with you in some format. Well, if you've been off for more than a certain amount of time, and that we'll call, you know, every couple of weeks, or we'll email, setting that up before someone is off is important. But once they're off, you don't want to use a tool like this until you know that they're ready to come back, because the employee is talking about their abilities in that moment, and if they're still sick, there's no point in having that conversation. You want to use this tool at the moment that they're ready to return to work.
The other thing I would add is that very often employees will go to their physician, their family physician, or their occupational health professional, and the physician or health professional knows nothing about the workplace or about the fact that there may be accommodations available or even that there could be a tool that they can use. So if the employee is aware of the fact that the workplace is offering accommodations, is prepared to work with the employee to facilitate an early return to work, and prepared to work with the physician and provide them with information on what might be available, this can also help things because the physician is often blind as to what the requirements of the workplace are and what might be available to help their individual. I actually had one physician who was one employee who was so annoyed with their physician for not sending them back to work that they sent a complaint to the professional college about the physician. So I don't advocate that as a method of moving forward, but I think that we have with the tool and we have with open conversation an ability to inform healthcare practitioners about what might be available and actually make their work a lot easier.
And it seems to me that the tool, based on the questions that you showed there, Mary Ann, in some of the sample pages, they look general enough that the tool actually seems to me like it could be used for both physical and mental health challenges.
Yeah, absolutely. It's the psychological and emotional factors of that particular job, and we avoid talking about illness or symptoms, and so you're absolutely right, Carla. It can also be used while somebody's still at work. They don't have to be off work in order to have this conversation.
Right. So we have quite a few other questions that have come in as well. One deals with peer support systems, and I think, Mary Ann, when you showed the list of potential resources that might be in place in the workplace that either managers or employees themselves may not be aware of, that was one of the things that was listed there. So maybe one of you could speak to some examples of peer support systems in the workplace and how those work.
The peer support is an interesting concept, and it ranges from the simple ability of people to relate to one another and talk about events together to a formalized peer support process where individuals with their own lived experience are trained as peer supporters and organizations implement formal peer support processes in their workplace. Two examples at present are NAV Canada and also the Durham Regional Police Services. There are other companies as well and organizations, including one part of the federal government, that are implementing formal peer support programs. But it doesn't have to be in the formal process. It can be just encouraging people to talk to one another as well, a sort of organic approach to things. If people want more information on peer support, we can send them the link to Peer Support Accreditation Certification Canada, which has a fair bit of information there on peer support, including some clips from the first national conference on peer support.
That's a great idea, and we'll certainly send that through as a follow-up. And actually, we had a webinar as part of our series a few months ago that actually showcased NAV Canada's peer support program. So that webinar is also archived on the Commission's website for those that want to look that up.
Marvelous.
So we have another question that came up as well about are there ever situations when either the employer or the employee should be involving a lawyer in discussions around accommodation?
Hopefully it doesn't come to that. I mean, it's when your rights are violated that you need to involve a lawyer. This process should not require a lawyer at all. And would you say anything differently, Laura?
No, I agree with what Mary Ann is saying. Early intervention is really important, and having the process in place before something happens with anyone in the workplace. So it really works most effectively when it's built in to the workplace. It's there, people know it's there, whether they have a union or don't have a union in the workplace. They know what the process is going to be. They know that the employer and the supervisors in the workplace have been in tune and trained and part of that and know how to help them with the process. if we look at it from a precautionary approach where we want to do prevention and are aware of how these things might play out, it should avoid that. Where there is a union in the workplace, that's what the union rep's job is. Their job is to assist that person or persons in the workplace, act as a liaison, and often I have been a union rep for almost 30 years. I was also a nurse for 30 years, so I clearly understand the process of it. And what we found was that the disconnect with communication all the way around. If we could improve the communication and we had a tool, that really helped.
Yeah, and just to go back to the issue about a lawyer, when we're supporting someone to do their job, accommodation is no longer a battleground. We're not looking at how does somebody get out of doing their work, but rather how does somebody do their work differently while they're experiencing a disability. So there's no legal issue here. We should all be on the same page.
That's great. Thanks very much. We had a question as well about small to mid-sized businesses, maybe that don't have an HR department within the company, and whether or not this is a tool that you think individual managers could use themselves in order to support employees.
Short answer is absolutely yes.
So it's simple enough that it doesn't need an HR professional?
Yeah, it was created for that purpose as well.
Okay. And the other question, and I do hear this from some organizations, that sometimes when you have a third-party insurer who's managing either the short-term or the long-term disability claims, that sometimes there's some disconnect between the employer and the insurer, and wondering if this tool might be able to be used to kind of advocate between that relationship, or whether you have, if not, if you have any other suggestions there.
Right, so because this tool focuses specifically on workplace issues, it can be something that's done in conjunction with whatever the provider does. It could also, if you discuss it with your provider, you may find a way that you can meld the two processes together. But it is that the insurance provider and their return to work may or may not include these types of workplace issues. So again, this tool was created so that it really covers the things that the managers often don't feel have been addressed in most return to work processes.
Great, and we have another question that came up that's specifically relating to bullying in the workplace, although I can see that it would apply in other situations just where you have conflict in the workplace between two individuals, and what happens where, in order to accommodate one person in that kind of a situation, then someone else is being impacted, and whether you have any suggestions on those types of situations.
So I'll use the phrase my lawyer friends use, which is, it depends. If there's a clear case of harassment or bullying, you must follow the protocol to deal with that. If it's one of the many cases where it's not completely clear that it was bullying, that it may have been a sensitivity of the employee or an insensitivity of the person accused of bullying, then there's another way that you can go about it, which is just simply to ask, what do you need to work professionally with this person? Make sure that the answer is measurable and specific, and as part of the accommodation process, you require the other person to behave in a certain way around them, and you hold both the employee and the person who is accused of bullying accountable for this new way of interacting. That is dealt with in more detail in the bullying and harassment section on workplace strategies for mental health, but also in the managing workplace issues section under resolving conflict. Any other?
I would say, this is Laura, I would say to support what Mary Ann has just said, that often supervisors feel uncomfortable, often the employer feels uncomfortable with these situations, and having them get some tools and having them get some understanding of the importance of protocols will help deal with the issue. But also, we have found where the issue has become more moderately severe on the end of the spectrum, that bringing in a mediator, a trained mediator, often works. And I've seen this work very effectively, where the two people have worked with the mediator to figure out just exactly the issues that Mary Ann touched on, and finding out how they can work with each other. One of the interesting things that they will give them as a tool is a trigger word for when they are finding they're irritating each other or they're getting stressed with each other. They come up with a trigger word to help them deal with that, and they can break apart and calm down. So there's many, many different ways of dealing with the issue, but certainly it shouldn't be left to fester.
That's great. Thanks very much. We have another question about whether the tool is flexible enough to accommodate when there's concurrent disorder. And the question's asking specifically about addictions, but it might apply to other concurrent disorders as well, where there might be rehabilitation required, support, and potential relapses.
I noticed a couple of questions along this line. The first one said, can this tool be used for physical occupational health issues as well as psychological? Well, this particular tool was designed with 7 aspects in mind that affect psychological return to work, but the process of providing information and of employees looking at what they're capable of could work equally well for physical issues as well as mental health issues. Again, it's a matter of making sure the health professional has an understanding of what the requirements of the workplace are and what the individual employee feels they're capable of doing, and then trying to bring those together. So the process is applicable whether it's occupational health or psychological health. As far as concurrent problems such as addictions, I really will defer to Mary Ann on that. I think she has more experience dealing with this than I do, not personally, of course, but in the workplaces where she does consulting. So, Mary Ann?
Yeah, I think in all of the issues that we talked about, the thing is that we have to get clear on what the expectations are in terms of what the organization is expecting. We have to get clear on what the issues are for the employee, and we have to get very clear on what the behaviors will be going forward and how that is accommodated or supported. And this is true no matter what the issue is. So the answer is yes, it can work in all of those. So the factors, the expectations that we cover are memory, exposure to environmental stimuli, attention to detail, overlapping tasks, time pressures, working relationships, exposure to emotionally stressful situations, and exposure to confrontational situations. These are the things that often are not covered in a standard return to work process, and the things that usually are problematic, whether we're talking about physical, mental, addiction-related issues. They're the things that we don't normally talk about, and they're covered here. I just want to comment, because I saw a comment come up about someone said bullying is not dealt with through mediation because mediation is, or bullying is abuse. And I'd like to reiterate that, again, with bullying, we have to be very clear about what is acceptable, what is not acceptable, how we're going to measure it, and then hold that person accountable. Whether or not an investigation happens, whether or not we say, yes, that's bullying or it's not bullying, we just need to be clear about what's acceptable, how we're going to measure it, and then follow up on it. And that way, we're not worried about the letter of the law. We're worried about what the expectations are in the work environment.
I noticed also this question about can the tool be used in a telework request. I believe it can. I know where employees have, in fact, made a decision based on a discussion between the employer and the employee about what the requirements of the workplace were and what the employee was capable of doing, to have that employee telework 4 days a week or 9 days a week, every 2 weeks at home, and come in 1 day a week to keep in touch with the team at work. So this process, this idea of people talking about what the capabilities are and what the requirements are, can be used in virtually any situation to try and improve the chances of good accommodation and success in the workplace.
That's great, thank you. We have another question that came in as well about why there would be a need to accommodate people when they're coming back to work, when presumably they wouldn't be coming back to work until they're well. So I'll ask you first to maybe comment on that, but I think there's a related question and maybe an education component there on how, as a manager or as the employer, do you communicate that to the rest of the team and explain to them why an accommodation may be required even though someone is now back from a leave of absence?
That's an interesting question, and really a lot of groundwork can be done by making sure that the organization is aware of the process being used to try and help people come back to work, and the fact that there's considerable value in people returning to work, that they get that the literature shows very clearly people get better faster if they're able to work, if they're able to maintain their social networks in the workplace. In fact, 90% of people, in my experience, want to get back to work as soon as they possibly can. So it's really not a huge issue, I don't think, for most employees. The block often comes with the health professional who says, oh, well, you're sick. You don't want to go back to work, I'm sure, for a few months or something. And this is taken as gospel sometimes. The other thing that tends to occur is that some workplaces, and less so now, fortunately, did follow this. You have to be 100% before you come back to work, and that's really a lack of knowledge on the part of the workplace about the impact of the workplace on their own employees' health, and the possibility that, in fact, the employee will be much happier being able to work and connect in their own social networks at work. Maybe Laura has some comments on this as well.
Yes, I certainly agree with that. In the 30 years that I've been working, it was certainly the case 30 years ago, whether it was physical or mental, that people stayed home until they were all better. And that could be for quite a long period of time. And we know that when people are out of the workplace for long periods of time, that it's harder and harder for them to return to work. It's harder for them to cope because they feel isolated and alone, and they may or may not have families or friends, and especially when there are mental health issues, it's still, as was mentioned early on, a stigma for a lot of people around them. So it's really important that we look at the progress the person is making, and whether the person is fully better or not, and we don't, that would be a great definition. How do we define when somebody's all better? But when they're ready to come back to work, and that may be after a short period of time when they've been off work or a longer period of time, but when they feel ready that they'd like to try and come back to work, that opportunity should be given to them. It helps them stabilize, and it helps them determine, where am I with this issue. Sometimes what will happen is people will come back to work, they'll be there for a while, and then they may need some additional time off. And it may be that there's intervals of this until they're fully reintegrated back into the workplace. But the key here is to enable them to help make that decision without somebody else making it for them.
I'd also like to add that this is a human rights issue. You would not tell somebody who is dealing with mobility issues, vision issues, or hearing issues that they need to stay off work until they can be well and not need an accommodation. If someone has a disability, including a mental disability, we accommodate that up to the point of undue hardship. So the question itself is flawed in that we need to accommodate people with disabilities to the extent that they need it. But I think the question is, are they coming back very ill and unable to do their job? And that is where we really want to make sure that people can be supported, that accommodation is possible. And if accommodation is possible, it means we're accommodating someone to do the essential duties of their job.
And I think, Mary Ann, in your response there, you may have addressed one of the other questions that came up around protection for workers that may feel vulnerable if they're coming forward and requesting an accommodation and therefore potentially disclosing a mental illness, and whether or not there are protections in place for those workers. But I think that you've addressed that related to your comment about the human rights protection, unless there's anything else you'd like to add there.
Just to reiterate what you said, the protection is there when you disclose. The protection for accommodation doesn't exist when there is no declared disability. There are some exceptions to that where courts have said the employer knew or ought to have known that a mental illness was present. But generally speaking, as soon as the employee is able to disclose and provide evidence that they have a mental illness, that's when the accommodation process is protected. Now, that doesn't mean that every person with a mental illness can be accommodated, but it does mean that the employer must show that they made an effort to accommodate.
Great. And I know we did in the questions that folks submitted in advance of the webinar, we did have a number of questions that related to the idea that, well, you know, what happens if the nature of the business or the nature of the position that the individual holds makes it either difficult or impossible to accommodate them. So I don't know if any of you have some thoughts on that specific question as well.
If they're totally disabled and unable to return to work, then people will be off work on LTD. But that's a process that has to be gone through and determined. Most of the time, there is a way to accommodate people, and it's just the employer wrapping their heads around how might that happen. I go back again to my early years when we were trying to physically accommodate people, and the employer would say, oh, there's no way we could do that, because they are so focused on the box that the job is in. And when you open the doors and the windows to that box and move it into a bigger place, you can see all kinds of ways to accommodate people. So there should be a thorough looking and reviewing of the job on how it could be done. It might have to be done outside the workplace for a period of time if that's available, or inside the workplace at different hours. There's many different ways to look at it. It's very rare that a person can't be accommodated, but if they can't, then there's other avenues to turn to.
And that's really the point of the tool, is that we try to give a menu of options for accommodation that helps somebody to do their job, rather than saying that the accommodation is they just can't do it. So there's so many in there, and we'll be adding more to it. One of the people who reviewed and looked at this resource said, can you add a few more questions that are about cognitive function? And of course, we were focused on psychological, emotional function, but what they said is it would make it a lot easier, because then they have the physical functional assessment that most are familiar with, and then this tool would cover off the rest. So that's one of the things that we're going to do to improve it. And again, we really welcome your ideas on what else, and then you can be part of creating something that's even better and more user-friendly.
We did have another question.
May I comment on the on the question that was on the website a minute ago with respect to reluctance of health practitioners to review 3 pages. 2 of the people that worked with us, well, all 4 people who worked on this were people involved as health practitioners in the workplace during their careers. And Dr. David Posen is actively involved still. And he felt that while this process looked onerous, it would actually become quite simple for practitioners once they get used to it. But he also pointed out that he felt that to do it properly would take an hour or so, as it involved the patient and some time on the part of the practitioners. And there should be some, because they're using their own expertise and providing input to the organization, there should be some payment of fee for this. And in fact, on page 3 of the download, you will see a sample letter that could be used by organizations to let the physician know or the health practitioner know that this is coming their way. Dr. Posen also pointed out that if issues aren't resolved at this level of the organization and at this time in the process, you might end up having to do an IME, and these cost many dollars more than the cost of a 1-hour consultation using the Supporting Employee Success tool. So I think those are good things to note. The other thing is that the occupational health nurses involved and the corporate medical directors all felt that this was an easier way to deal with these issues because it brought in information and other things that were important for all 3 parties. So if you have a reluctant physician or health practitioner, have a look at the tool, and on page 3, consider trying the letter that's suggested there as well. If I can just ask, Carla, I'm not sure if you put up the URL for Peer Support Accreditation Certification Canada, but if you could do that before the webinar ends, I'd appreciate it as well. Any other comments on health practitioners?
No, I think you covered it.
Yeah, the one question, probably the question that we had most often as people were registering for the session, Ian, and I think you did cover it in your earlier presentation slide when you talked about the final decision regarding the return to work plan really rests with the employer once this process has been gone through. But we did get a number of questions about, you know, are employers legally obligated to follow the physician's recommendation? What happens if the employer refuses to follow the doctor's recommendation? So I'm just wondering if you have any comments on that, when there might be a bit of a disconnect between what the physician may recommend through the tool and what the employer ends up putting in place in terms of the accommodation.
Well, I guess you know, the physician or the health practitioner is making a recommendation. The decision to follow that recommendation has to, I would say, rest with the organization itself. Now, if the organization has an in-house health practitioner, an occupational health nurse, or an occupational health physician or others in the field, perhaps a discussion between that in-house person and the outside health practitioner could resolve those issues quite easily. The other thing is to look at whether the health practitioner actually has a full understanding of what's needed in the workplace. And if not, again, the tool could help improve that understanding. Comments, Mary Ann or Laura, on that?
Just to say, it is a voluntary process. Laura talked about the 3 tenets, meaning you have to go into this with good faith. It's not going to work otherwise. But it has to be that the physician gives suggestions. What the tool does is manages the suggestions up front by giving them ideas that we know can support success. The employer could, if they wanted, cross out some of the ideas that they are not prepared to consider so that the conversation doesn't go that way. And they also have a place for comment to say this is what's possible and this is what the limitations are. But for sure, it needs to be something that is clearly understood by all parties, that the idea is that we're supporting this employee to do their job, and that's what the process is about.
It's Laura. I would say from a health practitioner's point of view, the physician looks at their job as being an advocate for their patient. And so they see their role as being the primary advocate in protecting that person from any bad things happening from them, to them in the workplace. And occupational health and safety is still a new, even though it's been around a long time, it's still a new realm for many family physicians in particular. And so they're still learning their way through, and it's a learning curve for them to understand what the work necessities are. And my particular realm of work as being a union rep, and many of my colleagues have found during the years that we've been doing this work, is that we've often had to work very closely with the family physician, because even if the employer is on board and wanting to do all the right things and the worker wants to get back to work, there may be a disconnect. And so what we do in our role is help that physician understand the work processes and how we can actually get them back to work without them causing further injury. So there's, where there is a union, you can use a union. Where there is not a union, it's good for the employer to have a process set up, either using this tool and or other processes to help the physician understand how they can get that person back to work.
Okay, Carla, I'm just seeing that we are running out of time, as usual. I just want to suggest that the handout contains more information, but also a lot of your questions that I'm looking at on the screen that we're not possibly going to get time to answer are answered on the website workplacestrategiesformentalhealth.com. And I just want to fast forward again to tell you that you can let us know what ideas you have, or even if it is more questions about this tool. And I will be able to add those to the, we're just going to go forward to the slide so you can see it there. You can write to me at maryann@maryannbaynton.com for any ideas that you have, suggestions for improvement, and I will actually make that happen. We're going to really look at what's possible to make this even better.
So look for a new revised tool in the fall. In the meantime, the present one remains available and is open to anybody free of charge to download.
That's great. Well, it sounds like we could have a whole nother webinar, maybe just on the topic of working with healthcare practitioners as part of the accommodation process, because I know we certainly haven't had a chance to answer all the questions that came in, and there were a number in that area as well. But certainly I'd like to let people know that we certainly will, if we could just go to the next slide, share a number of resources. When this document is posted on the archive, you'll have links to all of these resources and some others that we'll add as well based on some of the directions that the conversation took here today. And I'd like to let you know as well that our next webinar is coming up on June the 25th. We've moved it, for those of you that follow every month, and we usually host them on a Wednesday, we've moved it to a Thursday because of Saint Jean Baptiste Day, which is on June 24th. So our topic will be suicide prevention in the workplace. We'll be joined by Sally Spencer-Thomas, who's one of the leading experts in the U.S. on this particular topic and has developed a number of really fantastic tools and information for people. So hopefully you'll be on the lookout for that invitation when you receive it. And very finally, I'd like to give a big thank you to Mary Ann, Ian, and Laura for their excellent presentation. For all of you that have joined us for the webinar, thank you so much for your engagement and your questions and your comments, and I'm sure you'll have lots of great feedback to share with Mary Ann and the group as they're refining the tool moving forward. So thanks again for joining us. When you close the webinar, you'll be asked, and we'd ask you to take just a minute to answer a very short 10-question survey just based on your experience here today and some feedback for future sessions. So thanks again to all our presenters and everyone who joined us, and I hope you all have a great rest of the day.